So a lot of you will have actually heard of this project because I've done some talks at some conferences before. Some of you have actually been on trips to Zambia with me. And so actually this is pretty much a good update for people who've been visiting to Zambia and seen the work that we've been doing. So it's a part of a wider project, as Kirsty mentioned, working with Bats Without Borders, education, research throughout Zambia, throughout Southern Africa in general. So of course it's a collaborative effort, lots and lots of people working with us, and as I mentioned, lots of volunteers coming out, people helping with equipment, people helping to fix equipment. Some of you here have supported with that as well. So one of the focuses that we have is on agricultural landscapes. We have a bit of a food security dilemma. Huge worldwide growth in population, human population, and so of course food demand is going to grow. The largest increases we're going to see are in sub-Saharan Africa and also in parts of Asia. So the dilemma is basically how do we maintain some productivity, agricultural productivity, while still maintaining the ecosystem services that we actually need to maintain that productivity. So another reason why we're focusing on the agricultural landscapes is that we need to think about the environmental impacts that we're having in areas like Zambia, where there's huge increases in agriculture, commercial agriculture especially. So this is an area that has been cleared for soya beans and is irrigated by center pivot irrigation. So large fields, open areas cleared. Unfortunately, we don't really have very good estimates of deforestation in the area. More research needs to be done on this. We're looking at about 250,000 to 850,000 hectares a year cleared. So if we don't really understand the impacts that we're having just by directly cutting down trees, we're not really getting very far, and we need more information about the species that we're affecting as well. So you will obviously know that bats eat lots of insects, especially insectivorous bats, so those are the ones that I've focused my research on. Many of you will have read this paper, pretty famous paper, to show that bats have an economic contribution to agriculture. You will also see many papers that show the opposite, and you'll be hearing from Emma just now to suggest that there may not be a benefit to bats in certain types of agriculture. So our study area focuses on Zambia. As I mentioned, some of you have been there and joined us there. Central Africa to Southern Africa, sort of a mix of habitats ranging from sort of rainforest habitat to what we call Mayombo woodland, which is a sparse woodland, and pretty good species richness in terms of bats. We've got over 70 species of bats there. Currently, our tally is 78, but we've got some genetic confirmation to do. 9 families, so very, very diverse country in terms of species of bat. So obviously I've explained why we're focusing on agriculture, also focusing on the range of species that we've got in Zambia because it's a species diverse area. But we want to really know if agriculture is affecting the bats, and could they potentially be of benefit to the agricultural industry in Zambia in particular, but obviously this applies to other studies around the world as well. Specifically, we really wanted to look at how species activity and species richness may be affected by the different habitat types that are present on these large commercial farms, as well as the crop types. And also, we basically want to know, do the bats actually eat some crop pests? Otherwise, all of the research that has been done in other places around the world may not apply. So we focused on 3 areas, which are large commercial areas, some of which are expanding, some of which have been, one of which has been an agricultural area for a long time. 30 farms spread out throughout these areas, 10 in each area. And so we put out static detectors, 3-hour long stints from about half an hour after sunset, and we put them in both the crops and the semi-natural habitats that are present on these large commercial farms. as well as doing a driven transect of about 10 kilometres. So that was all the acoustic data. We also did trapping on the farms, which obviously is necessary in areas such as Zambia, where the acoustic information about bats is pretty lacking. And we also looked for roosts, basically. In addition to the static detectors, we paired them with insect traps in the crop fields so that we could look at potential diet and look at how the insect assemblages and insect numbers may affect the activity in the fields. This is my assistant Bernard, my current trainee. He's wonderful, but he's sorted out literally bucket loads of insects. The next step is to actually look at categorizing them. So when we're looking at commercial farming in Zambia, we're looking at mainly maize, soya, and tobacco. Obviously, tobacco is not a food crop, but it's very important in terms of an export crop. Natural habitats would be the Mayombo woodland that I mentioned. Often this type of woodland is also grazed, so it depends on the type of farm, whether it's mixed farming or just purely arable, as to whether it would be grazed or not. And then Dambo areas are basically wetland in the wet season and dry in the dry season, so very few trees grow in those areas. It's like mini plains, basically. So I'm not going to give you a whole load of statistics. Very boring, which is what I'm working on now. It's not finished yet. But I am going to give you a bit of an idea of how we've explored the data so far and what we think the information is telling us. So obviously the trapping was the very exciting bit. Many of you have been trapping out there with us, and it's very, very exciting. Lots of different species. And we take lots of morphological measurements. Very, very interesting in terms of identification. For this particular aspect, in terms of the agricultural focus, we're very interested in the release calls, because that will help us to not necessarily identify species, but at least put them into groups. As you can see here, the majority of species do overlap in terms of peak frequency. Obviously, we don't just use peak frequency for identification of bats, but it does show you how difficult it can be when you've got lots of different species in the same area with similar ecological niches, basically. These two with the highest ranges are the myotis, so they're relatively easy to identify based on call shape, but not to distinguish between them, each other. And then we've got a few rhinolophids and hippocyderises there, which again are relatively straightforward, similar to the rhinolophids here. But all of the others, as you can see, are basically the CF calls and the pipistrelle type calls, the hockey stick type calls, which are very, very difficult to distinguish because they're overlapping in many call characteristics. So instead, we've put them into groups of sonotype. So this basically is reflecting the ecological niches that they use. So from this paper from 2013, we basically categorized them according to that. So the open space ones would be like our noctules here, very flat calls using very open areas. Edge space, we're talking the pipistrelle type bats, and the trawling bats, obviously like our myotis here, very similar calls. And the flutter detecting bats would be hippocyderic rhinolophids. The others are not really very relevant to the data that we've collected so far. So the active gleaning bat, there's pretty much one species that has been classified into that group, and it doesn't occur in Zambia, so not relevant. Passive gleaning would be like the long-eared bats here, so we have Nycteris or slit-faced bats. Very difficult to detect on the detectors, and we haven't had any on the static detectors so far. And then, of course, the fruit bats don't echolocate, so not very helpful. These two bats are just representative of the top two, the open and the edge foragers. So that one is a molossid on your left and a pipistrelle on your right. So those are most commonly found, according to our data so far, on the fields. So when we split them up into these guilds, we do see a much better separation, and of course the other core characteristics do help with the categorization. So let's go on to the actual data that we've collected from the static detectors. As you can see, there pretty much is a very little difference in overall bat activity or foraging activity between the natural habitats and the arable crop habitats. Now remember, this is the number of passes within that 3-hour interval for each detector. When we zoom in a little bit and categorize the habitats more, we see a slight difference in the maize with a slightly lower activity level, but again, doesn't really show much difference. When we separate them into their guilds or sonotypes, we do see a little bit more foraging by edge feeders in the natural habitat. And zooming in again, similar sort of pattern. So far, when we're looking at our trapping data, we've caught 23 species overall over those 30 farms. 367 bats. Obviously, we've been trapping in other habitats and other areas of our research, but this is in farms alone. And our static detectors, we put out for 62 nights. Remember, there's more than one static detector out per night. And so 780 hours worth of data to go through just for the static detectors, and that doesn't include the transect data. The majority of that data is noise files. So if anybody knows anyone who wants to study crickets or actually is studying crickets, please take these off my hands. They are very annoying. But I do have a lot of bat pass data as well. So what have we found from this information? We basically found that the levels of foraging activity don't seem to vary between the different types of habitats that much, and that the highest activity seems to be these edge and open foragers. So obviously there's a lot more questions that we need to answer from this data and the other data that we've collected that we're still analysing. We need to look at a bigger landscape scale in terms of what other aspects may be affecting the activity levels on the farms. It may be a matter of, the lower activity sites may be influenced by proximity to water bodies, roosting sites, those sorts of things. So there's a lot more information we need to put together to find out these answers. We've also, obviously, as I mentioned, from looking at roosts, we've been collecting droppings. We've got 5 roosts that we're looking at the moment, and we're going to do some dietary analysis to look at what is actually in the diet and comparing that to the potential diet, which would be from our insect analysis. So as I mentioned, this is a very collaborative project, and Kirsty mentioned Bats Without Borders. We do a lot of other education type activities, talks obviously, and also training. We've currently got Bernard, who you saw the picture of sorting out the insects. He's doing an agricultural management course at college, but also helping with the bat work on the side, and he's wonderful. Some of you are already sponsoring him, but if you'd like to sponsor a trainee, please come and see me at the Bats Without Borders stall. We also give lots of roost advice the same way as you would do roost visits here, and obviously advice on bat boxes on farms is another project that we're working on. So one thing I have to say is thank you very, very much to everybody who's contributed photos during their visits. So the photos that you've seen on the slides are not mine. There's many people here who've contributed photos, so thank you very much. And also to people who contributed that I haven't used yet. They are wonderful. I'd like to thank you all for listening, and do you have any questions?